A century, in certain ways, is like a life. And as the end of a century approaches, people behave toward that century much as someone who is nearing the end of life does toward that life.
All right. So we are given sort of an analogy here. The author is just comparing or making this parallel between a century and a life. And, when there's the end of the century approaches, they're saying people behave in a similar way as one when they're at the end of their life. Whatever that behavior is, unclear. I feel like they might explain or give us more specifics about this. But this seems to just be sort of a statement, again, they're making this comparison with centuries and lives and the way we look back on them.
Yeah, it's like an analogy. Like what we do at the end of a century is what we do at the end of a life. We don't know what that behavior is, but whatever it is constant. Maybe it's like making amends. I'm not sure how that would work in a century. Like you're going to make amends to all the people you screwed over in like the 90s and 80s. That seems odd, but theoretically that could have been something that happened. Maybe it's about like reminiscing and like looking back like, oh, what are all the things that happened during this century? Maybe it's about fear for like the unknown, like what's coming next, like what's going to happen in Y2K or what's going to happen once I'm in the afterlife, if that exists. So sure, either way, behavior is constant. Let's see what else they say. So just as people in their last years spend much time looking back on the events of their life, people at a century's end blank. Think about it.
So we have the blank. So when we ever we have a blank, I always like to fill in the blank. Let's fill it in and see what we would think. But I would just continue the analogy. So just as people spend in their last year spend time looking at the events of their life, people at a century's end look back on the events of the century. That's how I would fill in the blank. What would you do, Ben?
Yeah, I like the same thing, which is we're just saying, at the end of our lives, we look back at the life, therefore at the end of the century, we look back at the century. So um, just to like make this analogy for the visual watchers, we have look back at blank, and then we have look back at life. So to complete the analogy is pretty clear here, which is we just look back at the century. We have our prediction at this point. These ones are fairly straightforward, should you know what you're looking for. So yeah, they ask us, which of the following most logically completes the argument? What do you think it would say if you just had to put it in your own words?
Oh, yeah, people at the century's end spend time looking at the events of the century or reflect on the end of the century. That's probably what I would say.
Yeah, exactly. We're just completing the analogy. So A, reminisce about their own lives. That breaks our analogy because we're talking about the centuries. And
Yeah, we have to have the century in the answer or reflecting on the century. Maybe if they were like reminiscing on your life in the century, but even then, like, did you live the whole century? No, like that, unlikely.
yeah,
Um,
we're trying to help them out. Like maybe if there's absolute, well, I mean, this won't be our answer no matter what because the house has the century. But like
yeah,
if we're helping these answers out, it really is a second pass kind of thing where it's like, okay, well, there was nothing there, therefore we can come back. Well, on a first pass, we have a pretty high standard. We just want to say they look back at the century. Like there's nothing
yeah,
else that we want to focus on.
yeah.
So B, fear that their own lives are about to end.
Also has nothing to do with the century.
Yeah, it's like, where's
I
this
wouldn't
fear
like this.
coming from? We're not
Yeah.
talking about fear of the afterlife. Also, like, even if we did have fear, that's another good point, which I totally missed, which is it's not about the lives, it's about the century. So B is double wrong. C, focus on what the next century will bring.
It's looking back on the previous century. If, again, if we had some situation where people in their last years spend time looking forward to what comes after life, I don't know, then maybe, but that's not what they say. They say they're looking back on your life, so we need to look back on the century, and C is looking forward to the next century, which is not the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's forward looking. We want to be reminiscing about the past century. D, become very interested in the history of the century just ending.
This is talking about looking back on the last century. Maybe not the exact language I said or would have said, but if you're very interested in the history of the century, then you are looking back at the events of the century, just like you looking back on the events of your life.
Yeah, and well, it isn't exactly what we said, which is like look back at the century, but it's close enough,
It's close enough.
especially
Yeah.
on the like the odds that anything else is even going to be competitive with this. We've already gone through A through C. We know it's not those.
Exactly.
So at this point, it's just E, which is reflecting on how certain unfortunate events of the century could have been avoided.
I think this is almost just too specific. Again, the analogy, it's people spend your last years looking back on the events of your life. Not if it were the negative events, or like the unfortunate events in your life that could have been avoided, fine. But again, they don't say that. We can't make up stuff that they're not saying. And so this idea of unfortunate events is just not accurate to the analogy.
Yeah, exactly. It's new. Like we're not talking about the regrets of our life, what we woulda, shoulda, coulda done. It was about just what happened. Was it good, bad, everything? And so when E hyper focuses in on the negative, that's new information, and we don't want to break the analogy. So this one's just, yeah, keep the analogy. We're looking backwards. What's the history?